So for the functions of the urinary system, we need to know that the urinary system is supposed to remove salts and nitrogenous waste from the blood. What this means is that essentially the urinary system is meant to remove junk from the body. Just as we go like in our normal everyday life, as we go through life, we're just going to naturally produce garbage, waste, and that garbage needs to be taken out. Otherwise, if the garbage accumulates, it starts to pose a problem. Think about like how if we don't take out the trash, then essentially what it does is it's going to start to accumulate and form like a hygiene problem, a sanitary issue, and it starts to be stinky. And so that's why we have to remove it from the body or remove it from our house. And so, in a similar way, um, as our body goes through chemical reactions, it's just going to naturally produce waste. And so, all of that waste that's produced from those chemical reactions eventually has to be removed from the body. Otherwise, just like garbage, it starts to become toxic if the waste products accumulate and build up in the body. Just like if that garbage would become toxic if it built up in your home. Then the urinary system is also meant to remove salts. I'm sorry, it's also supposed to help maintain normal concentration of electrolytes and water. And so that's referring to how the urinary system helps make sure that there's never too much or too little of anything in the bloodstream. It always makes sure that there's just the right amount of everything. Then it also helps control red blood cell production and blood pressure. So the kidneys have a way of monitoring the blood pressure. And if the blood pressure becomes too low, the kidneys have a way of increasing the blood pressure. And then also they have a way of monitoring the blood oxygen levels. And if the blood oxygen levels become too low, the kidneys have a way of increasing them. Okay, as far as the organs of the urinary system, that would be the kidneys, the ureters, the bladder, and the urethra. The kidneys are the ones that do all of the hard work of the urinary system. They're the ones that are sifting through the blood and they're trying to like take out the junk and keep stuff that we need. So they work quite hard in order to do that job. The ureters transport all of the waste that was removed by the kidney down to the bladder. Then the bladder is supposed to help temporarily store the urine. And then the urethra is supposed to convey urine to the outside of the body. Be careful not to confuse urethra and ureter. Ureters go from kidney to bladder, but urethra goes from bladder to the outside. Very important to definitely know the difference between them. Right, this is just a simple diagram showing where the kidneys are. And then it shows how the ureters go from the kidneys down to the bladder, and then how the urethra goes from the bladder to the outside. Okay, So we're going to kind of work backwards. We're going to start at the urethra and then work backwards to the other urinary structures. We need to know that the urethra transport urine from the bladder to the outside. We've got that by now. The urethra is the only urinary structure that's different between men and women. Right, because in both men and women, we both have two kidneys, we both have two ureters, we both have one bladder. And we both have one urethra, but our urethra's structure and purpose is different between men and women. So first of all, in men, they have a much longer urethra than in women. And then also the male urethra carries both urine and sperm, just at different times, but the female urethra only carries urine. Okay. Right, then in both men and women, our urethras have sphincters, a voluntary external urethral sphincter, and then an involuntary internal urethral sphincter. Okay, so the voluntary urethral sphincter, right, the external urethral sphincter is made up of skeletal muscle. That's actually why it's voluntary. And how we can control it is because it's made up of skeletal muscle. And then the internal urethral sphincter, the reason why it's involuntary is because it's made up of smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is involuntary. All right, now let's look at the bladder. So we need to know that the bladder collects urine from both ureters. The bladder is a highly distensible, or in other words, stretchy organ. We need to know that it has a smooth muscle called the detrusor muscle, but also inside the bladder, lining the bladder is supposed to be transitional epithelia. Transitional epithelia is supposed to be what makes the bladder very stretchy, and that gives it the ability to expand and deflate like a balloon. Okay, that's it to know for the bladder. Now let's take a look at the ureters. The ureters, there's two ureters, obviously one from each side. And the ureters actually enter the bladder from below, inferiorly. That's important to know because most people think that the ureters enter the bladder from above, but you'll see that the ureters enter the bladder at the very base of the bladder. Okay. Right, the ureters get their urine from cup-like structures called calyces. And so the calyces are supposed to be, there's minor calyces and then major calyces. Minor calyces are supposed to be like small cups, and then major calyces are large cups. Okay, we'll be able to see the calyces better after we look at the anatomy of the kidney. Okay, so we need to know that the kidney has two different types of tissue. It has renal medulla and renal cortex. The renal medulla is supposed to be in the shape of these triangles called renal pyramids. The renal pyramids are supposed to be made up of renal medulla. At the very tips of the pyramids, there are what are called renal papillae. And we can try to remember, I try to remember the phrase PPP, points on the pyramids are the papillae. Points on the pyramids are the papillae. And that's actually supposed to be where the urine comes out from each pyramid. So the urine is going to come out from the renal papillae. Okay, then right after the renal papillae, where the urine comes out, that's where you'll find the minor calyces, the small cups. So like this would be a minor calycine, this aqua, light blue here, here, here. These are minor calyces, catching the urine that's coming out from each of these pyramids. And then several of the minor calyces will merge and form a major calyce, which is going to be in this dark blue. Okay, and then after the major calyces, then there's the renal pelvis. Which is in the lavender. Okay. It goes from the renal pelvis to the ureter, and then from the ureter down to the bladder. Okay, and then all around the renal medulla, the renal pyramids, is supposed to be the renal cortex. And the renal cortex is important because that is supposed to be where the nephrons are located. It's in the renal cortex. Okay, all right, so speaking of the nephrons, right, the nephrons are the functional units of the kidney. These are the specific structures that are going to be looking at the blood and removing substances from the blood and putting them back in if they're needed. That's the job of the nephron. Those are the specific structures in the kidney that are doing that. Okay, then this is a good mnemonic for the different functions of the kidney. which is supposed to be a wet bed. A is for acid-base balance. W is for water balance. E is for electrolyte balance. T is for toxin removal. B is for blood pressure control. E is for erythropoietin. And then D is for vitamin D metabolism. So it does all of that. The first three are basically balance: acid-base balance, water balance, electrolyte balance. And then the T is toxin removal, B is blood pressure control, E is for erythropoietin, and then D is for vitamin D metabolism. Okay, so let's take a look at what exactly the blood pressure control is and the erythropoietin. The kidney is monitoring both the blood oxygen levels and the blood pressure coming into the kidney. If the blood pressure coming into the kidney is too low, then the kidneys will secrete a hormone called renin. And then renin is supposed to play a bigger role in the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. And the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system is supposed to help increase blood pressure. So technically, renin helps increase blood pressure. Okay, then the kidneys are also able to detect blood oxygen levels. And so if the blood oxygen levels are too low, then the kidneys are going to secrete a hormone called erythropoietin. Erythropoietin is supposed to go to the red bone marrow of long bones, and it's supposed to tell them to make more red blood cells. Because the idea is that, okay, if you increase the number of red blood cells, then you'll increase the amount of hemoglobin. And then if you increase the amount of hemoglobin, then that will mean that more oxygen can sit on the hemoglobin. And therefore it would increase the blood oxygen levels. Okay, blood flow. We need to know that the renal arteries arise directly from the aorta. And then the renal artery is going to divide, and it's going to become smaller and smaller and smaller until it becomes an afferent arteriole. So actually, one thing that we need to know is that blood never, ever, ever flows through the nephron. Only urine flows through the nephron. So the blood flow is parallel beside the nephron. Very important to understand. Okay, so anyway, the afferent arteriole is supposed to arrive into the nephron at a specific part called the glomerulus. Okay, and then the glomerulus is going to filter the blood. And then the exiting the glomerulus is going to be the efferent arteriole. So for the efferent arteriole, we can try to think E is supposed to be E for exiting. So it's going to exit the glomerulus. We need to know the efferent arteriole does not travel away from the nephron. It actually stays close by and forms peritubular capillaries and also vasa recta. Okay, and so the reason why these peritubular capillaries and vasa recta exist is so that way, in case the nephron needs to put something back into the blood, there's a blood vessel right there for the nephron to put the stuff back into. Okay, right, this is a good diagram showing the different parts of the blood flow. So this in green is going to be the afferent arteriole. This red ball is the glomerulus, the capillary. And then exiting the glomerulus is the efferent arteriole. And you can see that as it goes towards the the efferent arteriole then starts to form vasa recta. Yeah, it's called vasa recta when it's wrapped around the loop of Henle. And then it's called peritubular capillaries when it's wrapped around other parts of the nephron, like the distal convoluted tubule. Okay. Right now, let's actually start to really talk about the nephron. We need to know that the nephron has two parts to it: a renal corpuscle a renal tubule, a renal corpuscle and a renal tubule. The renal corpuscle only contains two structures. Let me show you the renal corpuscle. Everything in this green circle is the renal corpuscle. So that includes the glomerulus, the capillary right there, and then also the Bowman's capsule that's wrapped around the glomerulus. The Bowman's capsule is supposed to catch and collect everything that comes out of the glomerulus. Okay. Then the rest of the nephron is supposed to be part of the renal tubule. Okay. Before we move on to the rest of the nephron, we do need to know that there's a very specific part or a specific group of cells that's wrapped around the afferent arteriole, and it's supposed to be called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. And so the juxtaglomerular apparatus is supposed to be a special group of cells that monitors blood pressure and makes renin. So that's the very specific group of cells that we need to know is going to monitor the blood pressure and make renin if the blood pressure becomes too low. Okay, now let's take a look at the rest of the nephron. So we need to first know about the order of the parts of the nephron. First is going to come the proximal convoluted tubule. Then there's a descending loop of Henle. Then from the descending loop of Henle, there's an ascending loop of Henle. Then from the ascending loop of Henle, there's a distal convoluted tubule. And then from the distal convoluted tubule, there's a collecting duct. We do need to know about the functions of each of these. We need to know that the proximal convoluted tubule is supposed to be where a majority of everything is put back into the blood, but mostly sodium. We need to know that the proximal convoluted tubule is where most of the sodium is going to go back into the blood. Okay, and then you can also see that it is going to reabsorb glucose and also bicarbonate. Okay, then for the descending loop of Henle, the descending loop of Henle is going to be putting water back into the blood. Then the ascending loop of Henle is going to put more sodium back into the blood. Then the distal convoluted tubule is the last chance for sodium to be reabsorbed. Okay, and then the collecting duct is the last chance for water to go back into the blood. Okay. Right, then we also need to know about two hormones that are going to affect the nephron. So there's going to be aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. Aldosterone is actually going to stimulate the distal convoluted tubule, and it's going to tell the distal convoluted tubule to put more sodium back into the bloodstream. And we need to know that if more sodium goes back into the blood, then so will water. Water always follows sodium. So like I said, if more sodium goes back into the blood, then so will water. And then if water's going back into the blood, then that's going to actually increase the blood volume. And then if you increase the blood volume, then that's going to increase the blood pressure. So indirectly, aldosterone helps increase blood pressure. Okay, then for antidiuretic hormone, a diuretic basically makes you lose water or pee it out. So an antidiuretic is going to do the opposite. Antidiuretic hormone is actually going to help you conserve water. Okay, so right, it specifically tells the collecting duct to put more water back into the blood. And like I said, by putting more water back into the blood, that's going to help conserve water because it's not escaping in the urine. Okay, now let's take a look at urea. Urea is supposed to be a byproduct of amino acid metabolism. And amino acids are supposed to come from proteins. So essentially, when you eat proteins, and then the proteins get broken down into amino acids, the amino acids are then going to get turned into urea. Okay. Right now, let's take a look at uric acid. Uric acid is supposed to come from nucleic acid metabolism. And nucleic acids are supposed to be things like DNA and RNA. And so essentially, when you consume substances that have DNA and RNA, they're just going to get broken down into uric acid. All right, probably the last thing that we need to discuss is you definitely need to know about the flow of urine through the nephron. So urine production is going to begin at the glomerulus, but then it flows through the proximal convoluted tubule. Then from the proximal convoluted tubule to the descending loop of Henle, descending loop of Henle to the ascending loop of Henle, ascending loop of Henle to the distal convoluted tubule, and then from the distal convoluted tubule to the collecting duct, and then it's going to go from the collecting duct out the renal papillae, then from the renal papillae to the minor calyces, minor calyces to the major calyces, and then from the major calyces to the renal pelvis, and then from the renal pelvis to the ureter, and then from the ureter to the bladder, and then bladder to urethra.